and I will be correcting them soon. Torah 2, I gave them out. I gave them out. Torah 2?
Yeah, I had Torah 1.
All right. Then ask and you shall receive. So I wonder why I would never give out a test for Torah 2. All right. Well, it wasn't that long ago that you'll forget. So you'll get your test next week. But Torah 1, I guess, are the test that I haven't fully given back out yet. I think I've received everyone's test from Torah 1, I hope. You didn't get a test for Torah 1 either? You started late in the class, right? Yeah. All right, so I'll get you a copy for Torah 1. The people that are on the internet, that are viewing via the internet, I have at least one person's test that I have to correct. I received that last week. So I'll give back the tests next week, and you'll get Torah 2. It's not that difficult. All it does is it helps you to understand where you are and how well you're developing. All right, so we're talking now about the Egyptians. The Egyptians, they came to power, of course, way about perhaps somewhere in the 3rd century BC, the 3rd millennia BC actually, right around the time of the development of Babel, or shortly before the development of the Sumerian Empire, the Empire of Nimrod. The Egyptians came into power. The Egyptians were the descendants of Ham. His particular son was Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was the father of the Egyptian people, and the Egyptian empire was one of the early empires. It's believed that they built the pyramids. I don't believe they built the pyramids. I believe the pyramids were there before the flood, and they just met the pyramids there. So the Egyptians, their kingdom came to its highest point, its zenith, right around the time of the Exodus. That was their zenith. That was their most powerful period. Following the Exodus, of course, they began to decline. Within 150, maybe 200 years, their kingdom, their empire status was diminished tremendously. So, of course, we believe that that had something to do with what God did on behalf of redeeming the Jewish people. Scholars and historians will disagree with that. They would find some other purpose for the decline of the Egyptian empire. We know better, right, because we're Bible believers. Obviously, following what God did to the Egyptian empire, the way that he humbled them and destroyed their gods, that they would decline, and that's exactly what happened. They never resumed their status, their former status as a governing world empire. All right, so the Egyptians would never again come to power. They had following the Exodus, they had some moments when they were looking as if they were going to come to power, but they never actually achieved anything. So they were effectively the empire that God delivered the people of Israel from. Even during the time of the judges, Egypt was still attempting to assert itself or reassert itself. During this period, the Canaanites that were being faced with Israel, the Canaanites that were being threatened by the Israeli people, called out for help from Egypt, and Egypt couldn't help. In fact, Egypt refused to help the Canaanites. There was something of a commitment prior to the Exodus experience between the Egyptians and the Canaanites, but it didn't pan out following the Exodus. And why is that? Because their entire empire had been humbled, and they were not in a position to stand against Israel, even when they were moving in on the Canaanites. They didn't want in other words, they didn't want anything to do with Israel. And so following the decline of the Egyptian empire, we see the rise of the Assyrian empire. The Assyrian empire came into existence somewhere around 700 BC, 875 BC, somewhere in that period there. They came into existence rather slowly. They were there for millennia. Their capital was Nineveh, And Nineveh had been in existence since the time of the flood, following the flood. The post-flood era established by Aram, one of the sons of Shem. So Nineveh was in fact the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians really came to their power, to their highest, to their zenith, somewhere around 710, 720 BC. Around 734 BC, I believe it is, somewhere there, the Babylonian Empire came along and succeeded them. The Babylonian Empire was headed up by Nabopolassar, who was the father of Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered the Assyrians. The Babylonian Empire came to its zenith, came to its strongest period during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the son of Nabopolassar. Now, both the Babylonians and the Assyrians came into existence during the time of the kings and not the time of the judges. All right? So the Egyptian Empire had its power and its decline during the time of the judges. Right? So the period of the judges is when? 15 BC to about 1000 BC. So during this period, we see the decline of the Egyptian Empire and the rise of the Assyrians, but the Assyrians really came into power during the time of the kings of Israel, both Israel and Judah in the south. One of the things we're going to do in history too is delineate between the kingdoms of Israel. The whole nation of Israel was divided in two, right? And during the period of the kings, Israel was effectively two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. We're going to learn to distinguish between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom and why it's so important to see both kingdoms as distinct, separate from each other. We'll talk about that as we go along. Perhaps some of you didn't know that there was a divided kingdom, that the kingdom of Israel was literally divided in two, and its division was very clear and distinct. We'll discuss that some more as we study. So now the Assyrian came into power around the time of the kings of the north, particularly. The Assyrian Empire was the empire that God used to destroy the northern kingdom of Israel, the northern division of Israel. The Assyrian Empire was raised up, and I believe it was the hand of God that brought them against the northern kingdom. They became the instrument of judgment that God had put in place to bring an end to the northern kingdom of Israel. And then shortly after that, about a century or so roughly after that, we see the Babylonians. They come upon the scene. They succeed the Assyrians. And under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah, was then also subjugated to the Babylonians. The Babylonians destroyed the temple in 586 BC, took possession of many of the leading cities in Judah, and subjugated Judah. That period came to an end, and of course, we believe that it was God who raised up the Babylonians to be his own instrument of judgment against Judah. And later on, as we study, we'll understand exactly why God raised up these empires to bring judgment against his own people. But he did. Remember back, I think we read this in Leviticus chapter 26, that God said that if Israel would continue in sin, in idolatry, in disobeying his law, violating his Sabbaths, that he will bring a very specific system of judgment against Israel. Remember that. And the second thing he said he would do is he would bring enemy occupation against the people of Israel. He will bring war against Israel. Well, that's exactly what we see with the Assyrians and the Babylonians. He brings enemy occupation to the land of Israel, in fulfillment of what he said he would do if Israel would engage in idolatry and violate his Sabbaths. Right? And so later on, God will ultimately drive Israel into the nations, which was the very last thing he said he would do if Israel would persist in unrighteousness, which they did. And so he eventually drove them out. So following the Babylonians now, they're really, we know the subsequent history of the Persians, the Grecians, and the Romans. We'll talk about them later on. But during the actual period of the judges, there was an empire to the north called the Hittites. The Hittites. If you look at this map, what period is this map? Persian Empire. So you're not going to see You're not going to see a representation of the Hittites here. Let's see if we can find a more current map. Perhaps not, huh? Voila! No mention of the Hittites. There's one chance that we can find the Hittites, and we do not. Anyway, the Hittites were somewhere in this, if I can get this on, somewhere in this region up here, which is today's Turkey. This is about right where the Hittites' kingdom was firmly established. Carchemish, you've heard of the great wars between Egypt and Carchemish. Well, this was against the Hittite Empire. Ultimately, the Assyrians would come from the east and meet with Egypt at Carchemish as well. So there was some jostling between Egypt and the Hittites. The Hittites were in this area right here. The Hittites today are the Persian people. Excuse me, the Turkish people. The Turks of today are effectively the descendants of the Hittites. Of course, to the west of the Hittite Empire would be the Aegean Sea, who would then become the Grecian people. The Grecian Empire ultimately would come across the Aegean Sea and march all the way to Persia. Quite a march, right? So these are the principal empires that had some engagement with Israel during the period of the Judges. Not so much Assyria and Babylon. They came along as God's instrument of judgment. Some of the lesser kingdoms that affected the period of the Judges are, who would like to name some of the lesser kingdoms? You had the Moabites, who were always a constant thorn in the side of Israel. You had the Ammonites. Who were the Moabites and the Ammonites? Sons of Lot. They were the descendants of Lot and his two daughters. And then you also had the Amalekites. They were also a constant source of strife against Israel. Who else fought against Israel during this period? The Philistines during the period of the Judges, constantly. Who else? There was one occasion when the Ethiopians came up against Israel. A vast army of Ethiopians came up, even an army of Midianites. So you have all of these other smaller entities, not as large as the Hittites or the Egyptians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians, that would come against Israel. In other words, during the period of the Judges, like we've already said, there was a vicious cycle of what? During the period of the Judges? Let's talk about that. The vicious cycle began every time with sin. Sin, whatever the sin was. Usually the sin was idolatry or lack of faith. So you don't say, well, lack of faith. Yes, lack of faith can put you in the area of sin. So they didn't express faith in God. They didn't trust Him. They didn't obey Him, because faith and obedience, they go hand in hand. So they would find themselves in sin, and what would happen? They would find themselves in bondage, which typically follows sin, right? They go hand in hand. Following the bondage, Israel would cry out, which, if you're wise, you would do. If you're in sin and you're in bondage, hopefully you have enough sense to cry out. Not to cry out in pain, but to cry out to God. And God would hear, and He would send a Savior or a deliverer, however you want to say it. And that deliverer will come in the form of a judge. Tonight we're going to look at all of the judges. All of the judges from Joshua all the way to Samuel. And so once God sends a Savior, of course we know what happens, right? There's victory. Victory comes as a result of God's Savior. And then the cycle continues. This is what we see throughout the period of the Judges. A really vicious cycle. What's happening here? Anyone, what's happening here that they constantly find themselves back in this cycle? What's the essence of the problem? Why is there a constant returning to sin?
Usually it's because of their leaders.
Because of?
Their leaders. Whoever's over them, even in today. How the country goes, their leaders, the country follows.
Well, God raised up really strong leaders in the judges. The people by themselves, the people in and of themselves, all together, didn't place God as king in their lives. God wasn't seen as their leader. In the book of Judges, the very last verse in the Bible, in the book of Judges, is that every man did what was right in his own eyes because there was no king. They didn't make God king of their lives. And so as a result of that, sin perpetuated in the camp of Israel. But in this cycle in and of itself, sin, bondage, cry out, a generation or two will go by, and then they would return to sin, and they return to sin again. All right, so you have sin, bondage, they cry out, God sends a Savior, and then they return to sin again after 2 or 3 generations. What the fault here, the issue here is that they're not holding on to their history. They're not looking historically at what has happened in the past. They're not saying, well, here is what happened 2 generations ago. We sinned, we ended up in bondage under the yoke of the Ammonites, and God sent Gideon, and we were set free, and so we're not going to go that route again. They didn't consider their history, and so their history just kept recycling over and over again. All right, and ultimately it led to where God was prepared to give Israel over to the Philistines. And that was because of the sin of Eli. Tonight we're going to look at Eli and talk a little bit about Eli. So this is the situation during the period of the Judges. The geopolitical atmosphere was tense, particularly leading up to the end of the period of the Judges. Because of the sin of Israel, God was preparing to bring nations that will bring judgment upon Israel. So it was very tense. All right, let's begin to look at the Judges. So that's awfully small, right? Can you see that? Let me see. Moses of the tribe of Levi. So he is the first judge. We've discussed that before. He's the first judge. Called at Mount Sinai. When was he called at Mount Sinai? At the burning bush experience, he was called at Mount Sinai. Delivered Israel from bondage and served for 40 years. Right? He was a shepherd for 40 years in the wilderness. And when his time came to serve God with the people of Israel, he served for 40 years. And ultimately, he died by God's command on Mount Nebo. The judge that followed after Moses was Joshua. He was of the tribe of Ephraim. Joshua of Ephraim. He was an Ephraimite. Called at Mount Nebo, served as judge during the conquest of the land. He served as a judge for a good period of time. I don't know the exact period of time. The conquest of the land took about 7 years. I think he served for something like 40 years or something. He was called to be judge at Mount Nebo. So effectively, God said to Moses, go up the mountain, lay down and die, and in the process anoint Joshua because he will become judge in your place. Joshua immediately becomes judge, and he brings the children of Israel over the Jordan River into Gilgal, the land that we spoke about last week. So, what did God say to Moses? As a result of his rebellion, because he did not treat God as holy, what did he do that was not reckoned as holiness towards God? He didn't obey God's command fully. What did he not do? He didn't speak to the rock. He struck the rock twice. It wasn't God's instructions to do so. He did so. And God said, as a result of that, you will not come into the land. You will not inherit the land together with the people of Israel. He basically said, you will not cross over this Jordan to enter into the good land. Moses pleaded with God, and God said no. So God raised up Joshua that will actually take the children of Israel into the land of Israel, and he did. He led the children of Israel during the time of the conquest. What was Joshua's name before he became Joshua or Yahushua? Hosea. Hosea, the son of Nun. Hosea ben Nun. And so at Mount Sinai, Moses changed his name to Joshua, which means Yahushua, Yeshua, which means salvation from God. Joshua is effectively Jesus. It's the same name. Jesus' name was Yahushua. All right, so originally his name was Hoshea ben Nun, and he became known as Joshua. He led Israel throughout the campaigns that brought the land to subduance. Now, Joshua did not fully conquer the land. A lot of Canaanites and Philistines were left in the land even after the 7-year period, which was a great sin on behalf of Israel. Now, Othniel, he is the judge that actually followed after Joshua. Othniel was of the tribe of Judah. Pretty sure he was a son of Caleb. You might have to check me on that. Or he was certainly a relative of Caleb. Othniel. Excuse me?
You put it down as
Nephew. All right, so delivered Israel from 8 years of Mesopotamian bondage and served for 40 years. The Mesopotamian bondage, no doubt, had to do with the cousins of Israel, who were the Arameans. Or perhaps even not only the Arameans, but the Akkadians. The Akkadians were a people that existed in this area right here. They were Semitic. In fact, the Babylonians descended from the Akkadians. The Babylonians were originally Semitic. The Akkadians, and this is why I believe it would be the Akkadians, who were the Mesopotamians that came against Israel, because the Arameans generally were peaceful, especially amiable to Israel, because Abraham was an Aramean, right? And his two sons were considered Arameans, and the people of Israel were certainly considered extensions or relatives of the Arameans. Now, on the other hand, the Akkadians were very warlike, very aggressive. They were raiders, the classic raiders of this period, where they would raid surrounding peoples and devastate the peoples and run away. The Akkadians are probably the ancient Hyksos that would have terrorized Egypt. So this particular king, judge Othniel, defended Israel from the Mesopotamians. Doesn't tell us exactly which Mesopotamians, but I can feel pretty sure that at one point the Akkadians decided to come through, perhaps on their campaign against Egypt, and stop off in the land of Israel and harass the descendants of Abraham. We don't know that for sure. That's a supposition. But they would be the only Mesopotamians that would fit the bill, the Akkadians. But so Othniel defended Judah. He's of the tribe of Judah, defended all of Israel. He reigned as 8 years. So 8-year period. All right, then comes Ehud. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. Interesting that he would be from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was always a very small tribe existing within Judah, but he was of the tribe of Benjamin, Ehud. Delivered Israel from Moab. Moab are the people across the river, the Moabites. Delivered Israel from Moab, Ammon, and Amalek. After 18 years of bondage, there was peace for 80 years. So Ehud did a good job. His effort, his 18-year, his reign as a judge brought peace for 80 years. This particular conflict was quite sustained, right? 18 years of fighting. This is the problem with the Moabites and the Ammonites. They were constant thorns in the sides of Israel. That's why Lot should have stayed in Haran. We talked about that before. Shamgar was much like Samson. Not sure what tribe he was from. The Bible doesn't tell us what tribe he was from. Shamgar, he killed 600 Philistines with an ox god. What is an ox god?
Ox goad is what you stick the ox with when you
A piece of wood. A piece of wood. A stick. A stick. Basically a staff. So he killed 600 Philistines with a staff, an ox god. He must have been quite a warrior, right? Must have been quite a warrior to knock down these 600 Philistines. The Philistines were professional warriors. They were weapon builders. And to be defeated by any army would have been a slight against their livelihood, right? Because they make weapons. That's what they did. They fashioned bows, they made chariots, they did swords, everything. And to have some army in the Stone Age come along and defeat them, well, that's not so good. But then you have one individual with a piece of wood, with a stick, who defeats 600 of their warriors. Well, that's a real slap in the face. So I don't believe it was his skill. It was Shamgar's skill. I believe it was God's anointing. Because God would typically do with the weak what cannot be done in the natural and bring an incredible victory. So let's look at some of the other judges. Deborah and Barak of Ephraim and Naphtali. Deborah was of the tribe of Ephraim. Barak, he was the tribe of Naphtali. We know the story of Deborah and Barak, right? Deborah was the only female judge. Barak was the warrior. In fact, God called Barak to be the judge, the warrior and judge. But Barak, he wasn't up for the task. He didn't want to take responsibility. And so Deborah took responsibility in his place. 40 years of peace in Israel by defeating Jabin. Jabin was the king of Hazor, which is in the region of Lebanon. Bondage lasted 20 years. So the period of bondage and the war, the battle for Israel under the king Jabin of Hazor lasted 20 years. But they brought a period of peace, 40-year period of peace in Israel. So the story of Deborah has to do with Barak's unwillingness to enter into battle without her help. He figured that here's an anointed prophetess, Deborah, and he wanted her at his side as he went into battle. He was unwilling to enter into battle without her. And this was not exactly God's plan for Barak. God wanted Barak to be strong, courageous, and go defeat the Syrians, or the Lebanese Syrians. And he didn't. And what was the end of the story with Barak? Jael, who was a woman, ended up killing for Barak Jabin. So because Barak was less than courageous and less than valiant, God used Jabin. At the end of the story, it's an amazing story. Deborah sings a song. She composes a song. She sings a song basically about the cowardice of Barak and how God raised up a woman to defeat Barak's enemy. Right? And what did she do? Jabin was being chased by the armies of Israel. He ran into a tent, and I believe he fell asleep. He was tired from the battle, and Jael crushed his head with a rock and killed him. That's the story. And she got the honor. That's the song that Deborah sang, that Jael got the honor for doing what Barak wouldn't do. So Gideon of Manasseh, the region of Manasseh is the heartland of Samaria, the region of Manasseh. Now Manasseh had two places where he settled. He settled in this area right here, east of the Jordan. He also settled in this area right here, which is the heartland of Samaria, where Shechem was. So this Gideon was of the tribe of Manasseh. We know the story of Gideon well, right? Ruled for 40 years, defeated the Amalekites and the Midianites, who oppressed Israel for 7 years. So a massive army, and I believe the Ethiopians were also interspersed in there as well. I'll have to check the story. But the Amalekites and the Midianites joined forces and came up against Israel during the time of Gideon. And the story is a wonderful story, right? We were taught the story in Sunday school. What's the biggest takeaway from the story of Gideon? You talk about the fleece, of course. Gideon wasn't too sure about his calling, wasn't too sure about his anointing as a warrior. And he asked God to prove that he would, in fact, deliver Israel from Israel's enemies. He put out the fleece, and he asked God for a sign, and God said, okay. And he put out a fleece, a mat. And he put it outside his tent, and if there was dew on the fleece but not on the ground, then that was a sign. And God gave him that sign. And what happened? He wasn't satisfied with that. So he said, I'm going to put the fleece out again. If there's dew on the ground but not on the fleece this time, then I'll be sure that you've... And you know, God humored him. The angel of the Lord humored him a little bit in the process. Gideon was not so convinced about his call and his anointing. Eventually, he became convinced of it, and he became quite a warrior. The angel of the Lord told him that he was a warrior when he was not. He was trying to get away from the responsibility of being a deliverer, but then he became quite an awesome judge, an awesome deliverer. Once he got cranked up as a judge, he didn't want to stop, and he was quite effective. You know the story of what he did. The Amalekites and the Midianites had amassed in the valley of Megiddo, the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley of Megiddo. They had amassed themselves there, and they were preparing to march south and destroy Israel. And so originally there were 30,000 warriors, I think 30,000 with Gideon, and God wasn't too happy with 30,000. God saw the army of 30,000 as too much. God wanted to destroy this massive army with less than 3,000 men. And so God devised a way in which he can cull through the 30,000. And what was the way that God devised to cull the 30,000? Right, and so they went down to the brook, a brook somewhere in the area, and the ones who would take their eyes off the battlefield, the ones who would plunge into the water, who really wasn't concerned about the mission, they had to go home. The ones who would drink from the brook and keep themselves vigilant, well, those were the ones who were called into battle. So the vigilant and the committed were the ones. And how many men were there? 300. So he went from 30,000 to 300 men. And with the 300 men, they destroyed the army, the Midianites and the Amalekites that came against Israel. And what was the story? Well, we can go further with it. He had a plan, he devised a plan that involves lamps and shofars. And he went up on the mountaintop. God had instructed him that way, in fact. He went up on the mountaintop alongside where the army was, and a Midianite man had a dream the night before that concerning Gideon. And Gideon got up there, and he held up all the lamps. 300 men holding up lamps around the mountain, which gave the impression that they were surrounded by a massive army. And then they broke jars to sort of give the impression that they were advancing on the people of the Midianites, the people in the valley. And then they sounded the shofar. 300 shofars were sounded. So each man had a shofar. And that was enough. 300 shofars, 300 lights, and jars breaking. And the Amalekites were convinced that the dream that this Midianite had was about to come true, which is the armies of Gideon would destroy them. And the Amalekites and the Midianites turned against themselves. and they sort of trashed themselves into non-existence. Israel didn't have to, Gideon men didn't have to do much. They took the spoils of the battle, but the armies that were preparing to destroy Israel destroyed themselves. Yes?
Isn't that custom for the Israelites to do the shofar thing when they were going into battle, or not?
To this point, we don't see it as part of the battle plan. It became, God instructed Israel to do this, but the idea is, no, we saw it also with Jericho. We saw it also with Jericho, instructions by God. God said, surround the city 7 times, blow the shofar 7 times, and the seventh time the walls will fall. All right, he didn't tell them that the walls would fall. He just instructed them, and they did it, and the walls came tumbling down. So I guess from that point on, it became normative for Israel to blow the shofar. So the shofar became part of a battle plan going forward, maybe after Jericho. But the next time we see the shofar is with Gideon. And it's definitely part of the battle plan. Who gave Gideon the instructions for that? Well, God did. So that was God's plan. Of course, when the Midianites and the Amalekites heard the shofar, they knew the shofars, they knew that it was Israel, of course, because Israel is the army that will blow the shofar. They knew that it was the armies of Gideon, Israel's army. And so the Amalekites and the Midianites were destroyed by Gideon. Gideon, following this, he did go on to do some incredible things, notable things, I should say. And so then we come to Tola. Tola was of the tribe of Issachar, which was in the region of Galilee, the Galilee region. Served during the time of relative peace for 23 years. So nothing notable about Tola here. And then you have Jair. Jair was of the tribe of Manasseh. Served during the time of relative peace for 21 years. He lived in Gilead. Gilead was a region over there in the region of Manasseh. What does this tell us? That after Gideon, there was a sustained period of peace during that period, at least over 40 years, anyway. So then we have another judge by the name of Jephthah. Again, he was of the tribe of Manasseh. Delivered Israel from the Ammonites. Served as a judge for 6 years. The Ammonites, of course, they lived directly across the river. The Moabites were in the south. The Ammonites were further north. So this is the region of Manasseh. So the Ammonites were over here. So I guess the Ammonites had begun to cross over the river to affect Israel. Well, Jephthah was raised up as a judge, and he destroyed the Ammonite rebellion. And then you have another judge here. His name was Ibzan. Ibzan was of the tribe of Judah. Served during the time of relative peace for 7 years. He lived in Bethlehem. I got to do something about this. Maybe I change the color of the letters. So he lived in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, well, that's basically the heart of the region of Judah, right in this area right here. So this is the region of Judah. Bethlehem, you have further south, you have Hebron. Where is Hebron? Somewhere here. Hebron, Bethlehem, Gibeon, Bethel further north, and so on. So he lived in Bethlehem. Ibzan, we don't know much about him otherwise. We don't know what tribe he was from. Oh, excuse me, Judah. And then you have Elon of Zebulun. Where was Zebulun? Further north in the Galilee region. Served Israel for 10 years. Don't know much else about Elon. Then you have Abdon, who was of the tribe of Ephraim. All right, Ephraim served Israel for 8 years. Not much is known about Abdon. Then, of course, we know Samson, Shimshon of Dan. So where was the region of Dan? Dan basically went west of the region of Manasseh, in this area right here. Dan Dan also went further north as well, up in the region of the Golan Heights. But Dan generally, well, at this period for sure, Dan was in this area right here. So Samson, or Shimshon, what do we know about Shimshon? There was a movie out last year that told the story of Samson. He's quite a warrior, right? Well, we don't know how much of a warrior he was in and of himself, but certainly in God's anointing, he was a warrior. Now, he was a Nazirite, and once he was under the Nazirite vow, he was apparently undefeatable. Could not be defeated. Now, every Samson movie I've ever seen will depict Samson as a really large, muscular guy, right? Nothing like myself, but really big, strong, warrior-looking guy, and so it gives you the impression that Samson had some great strength in and of himself. Well, the story doesn't reflect that. In fact, the Philistines didn't look at him and say, well, he's an awesome-looking dude, I'm not going to fight him. They had no problem approaching him. His hair, of course, part of the Nazirite vow, the vow of the Nazirite. You don't cut your hair, you don't drink any wine, you eat certain foods. It's a commitment vow. And as long as he was faithful to the vow of the Nazirite, he would be a victorious warrior, and he was. He was consecrated for this purpose from his birth. Fought against the Philistines as one man, served for 40 years, 20 years. We know the story of Samson well. How many Philistines did he kill with a donkey jawbone? 1,000. 1,000 Philistines with a donkey jawbone. He delivered Israel from the hands of the Philistines many times. The end of the story isn't so attractive. What happened? He divulged his Nazirite vow to Delilah. And Delilah, of course, she was working on behalf of the Philistines, and she told the Philistines, but she cut his hair, I think, and the Philistines prevailed over him. Finally, he gained his strength back. He repented before God, and he destroyed the temple of Dagon, the god of the Philistines, and apparently killed a lot of the Philistines in the process. Yes?
Against the Philistines as one man. My question is, was he supposed to fight as one man, or was he supposed to have, like the other judges, a small group, or 300 men like Gideon, or maybe more people from the other tribes?
He didn't
was he supposed to do it?
From the story we find in the Bible, I guess the question is for the people on the internet. I should be relating the question to the people on the internet. The question is, should Samson have had other warriors alongside him? Implying that that was his mistake. He didn't have other warriors to work with him. Well, I don't think he was supposed to have anyone else with him. I think he was supposed to defeat the Philistines as one man. He was anointed for that purpose, and God was certainly using him once he was obedient. So the story about Samson is really about obedience. Really about obedience to God. When you obey God, you have that position with him. You know, over and over in the Bible it says, draw near to me and I will draw near to you. When you're with me, I am with you. God has said that many times in the Bible. And so Samson departed from God in that he didn't obey him. And he didn't keep his vow. And because of that, we see the defeat. But God is a God of second chances, and he gave Samson a second chance to bring victory for Israel and to defeat the Philistines. The reason I say that it wasn't for him to have anyone to align with him, any allegiance with anyone else, is because God anointed him from the very beginning. In fact, Manoah, who was the father of Samson, had an interaction, had an encounter with the angel of the Lord. His wife, Manoah's wife, she was barren and she couldn't have any children. And the angel of the Lord came along and promised that she would have a son. And there was some interaction between Manoah, his wife, and Samson, and the angel of the Lord. And because of the fact that the angel of the Lord caused Manoah's wife to bear a child, that was the basis for the ministry of Samson. The child that was a supernaturally conceived child came along and became a mighty warrior and defeated the Philistines. If God wanted him to fight alongside others, he would have led him in that way, but he didn't. Like Shamgar, he defeated the Philistines, 600 of them, with a staff. What does that do? Well, it glorifies God. It says here is one man with a staff who defeats 600 advanced warriors, and the Philistines were that. They were advanced warriors. And so it's the same thing with Samson. Here is one man, probably not a very strong-looking individual, from my point of view, an average Israelite. And the average Israelite of that time was about 5'5", 170 pounds, maybe. So this was Samson, I believe, not visually threatening at all, but God had anointed him to do what he did. So here is this average Israeli who picks up the cadaver of an ox and defeats 1,000 warriors. That gives glory to God. You see, God could have raised up 1,000 Samsons. He could have done that. He could have anointed 1,000 men and defeat the entire world if he wanted, but he wanted to bring glory to himself with this Samson. And that's why I believe that Samson was not, the visuals with Samson was not what you get in the movies. You know, good looking, handsome, rugged, 6'6", 300 pounds. I don't think so. All right, so he fought against the Philistines as one man, served for 20 years. Then that brings us now to Eli. Now we're coming towards the end of the period of the judges. The story of Eli is what? A very sad story. Who was Eli? He was a Kohanim. He was a Gadol Kohanim. He was a Gadol Kohen. He was a high priest. He's a great high priest. He was less than faithful to God. He himself, as an individual, must have been somewhat faithful in his life. He was a judge. So perhaps when he was younger, he fought. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But he served as a judge during a time of conflict in Israel. The people that were bringing the conflict against Israel were the Philistines. But it doesn't tell us anything about his early years, only that he was a high priest. He had 2 sons that were corrupt. And when the time came for him to make a decision relative to his sons, he didn't. What did God do? God sent a prophet. It simply says a man of God appeared to Eli while Eli was in the tent. But the man just appeared. He appeared in the tent. And he spoke to Eli. And what did he say to Eli? You're not that faithful, Eli. And because of your lack of faith, God is going to destroy this tabernacle. He's going to destroy your family. Your sons will be taken away from you, and this priesthood will be given to someone else. After Eli, the tabernacle in Shiloh was destroyed, and the Philistines ended up with the Ark of the Covenant. Eli died. His 2 sons were taken into battle, and I believe they were killed as well. Right? That's the story of Eli. And what was Eli doing? He was allowing his sons to get away with whatever they wanted to get away with. They were fleecing the people. They were taking advantage of the people. They were growing fat with the sacrifices. So the people were bringing sacrifices to be made and to be handled in a certain way, and they were not handling it in the right way. They were corrupt. They were corrupt. And he didn't want them to... He didn't want to upset the apple cart by demanding that they repent. And so that's the outcome of Eli. But God brought Samuel into the picture this time. And Samuel, now he is the very last of the judges. Served during the Philistine oppression. He was the last judge of Israel. Samuel anointed Saul and David as kings in Israel. So Samuel was quite a judge. During his time as judge, Israel really came together. The accounts that we find in both 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, concerning Samuel is that he was well respected throughout Israel. When he would show up, people would pay attention. Samuel was here. So we don't see Samuel in light of his greatness, in light of his faithfulness very often, but he was apparently incredibly faithful among the judges and had a respect that we don't see with the other judges. Samuel was that boy, that child. In fact, before he was born, he was ordained. Could we say that? Yeah, before he was born, he was ordained. His mother Hannah was barren. She went to the tabernacle in Shiloh, and she wanted a son. She was of the tribe of Levi. In fact, she was a Kohanim. Remember that the Kohanim were the sons of Aaron, and she wanted a son. She wanted an offspring. She wanted a son. And she made a promise to God. She said, God, if you would give me a son, I will give him to the work of your tabernacle. Because she knew that she was a Cohen. Her son would be a Cohen. And God did in fact give her a son, and she named him Samuel or Shamuel, which means, what does Shamuel mean? God hears. God of Israel, well, God hears. So that was an appropriate name for Shamuel, right? God hears. And so he becomes this child. He's serving in the tabernacle alongside Eli. Eli realizes that there's something special about Samuel because God is speaking to Samuel and not him. God had already spoken to him and called for repentance. He didn't. And then God sent that prophet that will basically announce what would happen. All right, so Samuel becomes effectively a high priest, well, not a high priest. Well, the priesthood was basically done for a while. After the tabernacle was destroyed, he was a Cohen. Samuel was a Cohen, and also he was a prophet. He was a priest, a prophet, and also a judge or a king. So from a certain point of view, Samuel functioned in the office of Moses pretty well. He was a priest, a Cohen. He was certainly a prophet, absolutely a prophet. And he was, again, a king, a respected judge, like Moses and Joshua. So Samuel was the appointed judge that was directed by God to anoint a king for Israel. Why did God want to appoint a king for Israel?
The people wanted God to appoint a king.
All right. The people wanted a king, like the Philistines had a king. The Ammonite had a king. The Moabites had a king. All of the surrounding peoples had kings. And the kings would take the responsibility for the people. The king would watch over the people. He would protect the people. He would also fleece the people. And of course, Samuel knew this, and God, of course, knew this. But the people wanted the king to be just like the other peoples around them. They saw the value in having a king, even though they did have a king. Their king was God himself. And when Samuel got a little upset about it, he took the situation to God, and what did God say? God said, I never appointed you to be king. They rejected me, not you. Samuel was taking it personally on behalf of God, and that kind of adjusted Samuel's attitude a little bit. Samuel goes on to serve God for a lengthy period of time after he appointed Saul and David as kings. What was Saul's issue? Saul was the people's choice, right? He was the people's choice. He was the popular choice. He had all the attributes of a king. He was a head taller than everyone else. So he was probably 6'1", 6'2", perhaps. A head over all the other Israelites. And he was good looking, apparently. He was a warrior. He had the potential to be a warrior, larger than everyone else. But he had a character flaw. What was his character flaw? Right. He had his finger on the pulse of the people and not on the pulse of God. So rather than put his finger on the pulse of God, he had his finger on the pulse of the people. He wanted to please the people, make sure that the people were pleased, as if it were the people who appointed him there to begin with, right? And so Saul had a very typical dilemma. Do I trust God or do I trust the people? Do I work to please the people or do I work to appease God? That was his dilemma. Did God want Saul to appease him? I know sometimes we feel like the word appease and God should not go together. But the basic truth is, God expected Saul to obey him and to follow after his every word. In doing so, he would appease God. Right? So God expected Saul to appease him, and he didn't. Saul went after pleasing the people instead, and he was rejected. There's that iconic verse in the Bible where Samuel says that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and insubordination as the iniquity of something. So his sin was as the sin of witchcraft. What does that mean? Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and insubordination is the iniquity. What's the difference between sin and iniquity?
Iniquity is the tendency to do sin. Sin is the sin itself.
Right. In the Hebrew, the two words are different, of course. And iniquity is really a tendency towards sin. The sin is when you carry it out. So insubordination is the tendency that leads towards the sin of witchcraft, rebellion. So whenever you encounter someone that seems to have an innate spirit of insubordination, they cannot surrender to God's authority, you can be sure that the next thing to follow would be rebellion. It's pretty cut and dry. You encounter someone who has a problem with God's authority and being subordinated to God's authority, you can be sure there will come rebellion. So that's why Samuel said to Saul, rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and insubordination as iniquity. So what does witchcraft and rebellion have to do with each other? Why is he comparing rebellion with witchcraft? What's that about?
Because you are arranging for people to start doing what you're doing and not doing what God wants.
Okay.
And you're making it happen.
Okay. Rebellion and witchcraft, what's the connection?
Well, the first one who rebelled against God was Satan. It was the God from heaven.
With Achan?
Satan.
Satan, yes. All right. Satan is he's the progenitor, he is the archetype of rebellion. But what about rebellion itself makes a comparison between it and witchcraft? All right, so I'll share with you what I believe. Witchcraft is a sin of the spirit. It's a sin that connects to the human spirit. Witchcraft has the potential, has the ability, I guess I should say, or the potential to be very, very captivating, almost contagious, whenever it's being actuated. When someone is practicing witchcraft, they become very influential. I've seen it. I've seen it with my own eyes. In the context of a congregation, I've seen it. And that person becomes very influential. Well, rebellion is very much like that. The sin of rebellion can catch on in this very same way. It appeals to the same nature, which is to control. When someone embraces the spirit of rebellion, their purpose is to have their way with any given one situation. So they rebel in order to control something. Well, that's what witchcraft does. And the effects are very much the same. It tantalizes, it captivates, it draws people in. So rebellion, from the standpoint of Samuel, is like witchcraft. It is very contagious. It draws people in, draws you in. If you've ever been in a mass protest or some sort of a insurrection, mass, and you're around a lot of masses of people, and everyone's uptight, everyone's rebellion. What's your human reaction like? What will your human reaction be? To be drawn right into it, to just be sucked right into it. I've experienced that before. Just before there came a hail of bottles from the horizon, and we all had to run. So yes, rebellion is like witchcraft. It has that draw-in effect. It can draw you in and captivate you. And so what was happening at the time? What happened at the time with Saul and the Amalekites and the people of Israel? Well, we know the story. Saul was commanded by God through Samuel to destroy the Amalekites completely and to not hold on to anything, destroy everything they had, even the animals, the women, the children, the warriors, destroy everything, raise everything, bring it to the ground. That was God's command. And what did Saul do? Well, he did the political thing. And it was politically expedient for him to destroy all the flock, the livestock, and to keep some of the women. Why? Because they saw no sense in this. It was advantageous for them to keep some of these things. And so obviously agreed. Didn't have the backbone to say, no, this is God's will, and we won't do it. He didn't have that fortitude, and so he caved in. And that's the essence of rebellion. And once he caved in, well, that particular rebellion spread throughout the camp of Israel. Samuel comes along, and he's the only one, well, apart from God himself, he's the only one that's willing to do what God wants him to do, and he does. Go ahead.
You said you had seen witchcraft in a congregation.
Yes.
You mean rebellion or witchcraft?
I've seen both of them. I've seen it in many forms, on many levels. I'll tell you a story. One time, one Sunday morning, I was sitting in my office. I was pastor at that time. And I saw two ladies pull up, and they came around here. And when they got to where the little bridge is there, I looked at them, I beheld them, and their countenance was speaking something entirely wrong. I saw in their demeanor and their countenance, the way they were relating to each other, their body language, and their countenance, that something was wrong. And I immediately suspected witchcraft. They were visitors, just popped out from nowhere, and they're coming in. But there was an anxiousness that I saw in them. There was almost a sense of pretense by just looking at them for about 5 seconds. So I came over right away, met them minutes before the service, and I approached them. I shook their hands, began to interact with them. And now I realized right away that one of the women, the younger woman, was very nervous. She was acting as if she was supposed to be very quiet. But she couldn't help herself. She was nervous. The other woman was very evasive, and basically she was lying to me about how they found the congregation. I caught her in 2 or 3 lies in a matter of a couple of minutes. And she herself was nervous, but putting on a good show. So finally, after about 4 or 5 questions, I asked the woman who was doing the talking, I said, so who sent you here? And that question was probing enough for her to come out and divulge exactly what she was doing. Finally, I told her, you're welcome to stay, but you'll find yourself very uncomfortable. And she stayed for some of the worship, and she took off. The younger woman was incredibly uncomfortable. I thought she was going to manifest. But they took off. Now, they were witches. They were sent by a covenant, a group of ladies, a group of witches. And the other woman basically said it without coming out and saying it. She said it. Because when I said, who sent you? She didn't look at me like, what are you saying? She said, oh, I have friends, and we wanted to come and visit. Oh, yeah, you have friends, all right. And so they took off. That's blatant witchcraft. And that's easy to pick up. The witchcraft that's more difficult to pick up is when a believer is unknowingly in a place of complete manipulation and control over people in the congregation. All of it is Satan. But sometimes a person could be given enough leverage in a congregation to where they become incredibly influential. And that person may or may not be an actual functioning witch. Sometimes they're not, but their personality and their demeanor, their spiritual demeanor, lends itself to witchcraft, spiritual witchcraft. And they become very dangerous. And I've seen that very vividly, and the destruction that that person brought took out 4 or 5 families and brought a tremendous amount of strife and pain and difficulty to the congregation because she was allowed to fester. My position coming away from seeing that is no witch is going to fester here at fellowship.
You have to have church discipline.
Yeah. So we saw that, and it's not pleasant when we see it. It's downright ugly. And there are other examples that you can look at. Even a pastor, if you allow a pastor to manipulate and control a congregation, well, that's the end of it is, in fact, the pastor becomes in the vein of the spirit of witchcraft. And he's in rebellion against God, for sure. So manipulation is one of the clear-cut signs that someone is functioning in practical witchcraft, whether it's actual witchcraft or not. And we've seen it on different levels. It's not attractive, it's always destructive.
When you describe signs, it sounds a lot like a Jezebel spirit.
Well, Jezebel is the quintessential. I mean, she's the archetype of every witch that we find in the Bible. She is. Jezebel is that one.
So what you just described, it was like a Jezebel spirit.
Well, that is a Jezebel spirit, yes. The Jezebel spirit is what we call a Jezebel spirit, is prevalent among religious people, typically women. Don't think that a Jezebel spirit can't inhabit a man as well. It can, very much. We've seen that as well. And the purpose of a Jezebel spirit is to bring destruction in every case, to bring destruction. And they're not hard to recognize. They're not hard to recognize. The key to a Jezebel spirit is to deal with it quickly. And the last 4 years, we've had 2 of them come through. One was allowed to be here too long, maybe a year or 6 months too long. The other one went quickly, and the other one was a male figure. And Jezebel, they're here to control, they're here to manipulate, they're here to ultimately destroy. But if it's the spirit of witchcraft, yes, spirit of witchcraft, it's always in the vein of rebellion and manipulation.
And always trying to get clever positions close to the head.
Absolutely. They're always striving for a leadership position or to draw near to the pastor or the elders. They're always working in that vein, and if you allow them, they will reap destruction every time. So it's not attractive, but it's the spirit of witchcraft, rebellion. But a clearer indicator of witchcraft is manipulation. Yes?
Someone was dead, and then Saul was having problems, and he went to a witch, and he called someone. Was it really someone who came to talk to Saul after he was dead?
The Bible says it was Samuel. The question is, was it really Samuel that was brought from the dead, right? With the witch at Endor, who apparently summoned Samuel. Well, we have to conclude that it was actually Samuel, because that's what the Bible says. Now, how did it happen? It can only happen if God allowed it. God was behind it.
Another question related to this. For instance, if a relative is dead and the mom goes to a witch to call the dead relative, and the dead relative comes back, say, according to the mom, what is it? Is it really the relative who died, or is a demon disguised as?
So you talk about what the Bible, what is referred to as necromancy. All right, interaction with the dead. The Bible forbids it completely. God forbids it. Necromancy is absolutely against Torah. Saul was the leader of Israel, and he went way outside of the parameters of Torah, and did something that Torah rigidly forbids. God reacted the way he did, and it was a signification of Saul's judgment. So God brought Samuel to be that rebuke against Saul. That's the only conclusion I can come up with. Necromancy is against Torah. No Christian should be attempting to engage any spirit, family spirit or otherwise. It's something that we're not to do at all. Because, and I can go on about why we shouldn't, but suffice to say, it's a spiritual activity that we should never be involved in. Never. Ouija boards, for instance. Ouija boards is necromancy, right? Because when you engage a Ouija board, you're supposedly interacting with dead spirits or spirits of dead people. Well, that's nonsense. You know that today, Christian Ouija boards that will bring you in contact with angelic beings that will aid you in your life, and they're Christian Ouija boards, yes. I've seen one. It's all witchcraft, and it's the worst kind of witchcraft as well. Here is the problem with necromancy, the act of interacting with dead spirits or spirits of dead people. The problem with that is you initiate yourself or you bring yourself into contact with the spirit realm on a level that we're never supposed to be involved in. That affects our very soul and can open us up to all sorts of demonic issues. Right, and so?
Yeah, I was asking because many Catholics in my country practice that and say that grandmother died and they call the grandmother and they say that the grandmother comes back and takes care that no robber will go into the house. That's what they said. And I was asking, is that really the grandma or is that
Right.
spirit?
So, all right, so to answer the question, or to respond to your comment, Roman Catholics are known for necromancy. They're known for it. In fact, a lot of their religious foundation is based on interacting with the dead. Yes. They pray to dead saints. So what are they doing when they spiritually make contact in their minds with dead saints? That's necromancy. They're praying to dead human beings. They're calling on the spirits of the dead. Right around Halloween time, in fact, just in conjunction with Halloween, is All Saints' Day. And All Saints' Day is a celebration. It's a holy day for the Roman Catholics. And they go out to the cemeteries and they light candles on All Saints' Day and they go to the church and they pray to all the saints. But what is that? It's necromancy. It's what the Bible forbids that we should ever do. So yes, many Roman Catholics honestly believe that they can have interaction, they can have conversations with dead relatives, with ancestors, and so on. But it's not what it's all cut out to be. You get yourself in a place where you're interacting with actual demonic entities, or you become incredibly exposed to demonic entities. I don't think there's any truth to it. I don't think there's any actual reality of interacting with dead ancestors or dead relatives. I think you actually interact with demonic beings. So there are many people who experience very, very strong demonization, what some people call demon possession. There are many people who experience incredible bondage, demonized, in a place of being demonized, and they're there because of Ouija boards, or they're there because of seances, or they go to a fortune teller who would read their hands or their palms, look into a crystal ball and speak to them concerning their future. And they find themselves wrapped up in incredible bondage, demonized in many cases, because they're engaging in something that the Bible strictly forbids, you know. And so right very close to us here, about 20 miles north, is Cassadaga. According to Google, Cassadaga is the occultic capital of the world. That's what it says. Cassadaga, right here in Central Florida, is the occultic capital of the world. What do they engage in primarily at Cassadaga? The very thing that we're talking about. Primarily, that's what they do. So you can understand why I have a certain view about where we are in Orlando as it relates to the occult. So just north of us, 20 miles north of us, is Cassadaga. According to the internet, the occultic capital of the world. About 20 miles south of us is the Magic Kingdom. So we have the Magic Kingdom, Kingdom of Magic. Who would be the prince of that kingdom? You figure. So about 20 miles south of us, we have the Magic Kingdom. About 20 miles north of us, we have the occultic capital of the world. We're snuggled right between a lot of spiritual corruption. Anyway, let's take a break. And so the judges of Israel, what more could we say? Let's take a break and we'll try and get to a study guide tonight.
It may be that at that time you weren't a member, so I had to set up an account. Let me go check. Yeah, it's May. No, I don't need it. Just May the 19th. Yeah, let me go check.
Okay, so, okay.
All right.
Insubordination is the facility, which is as the nature. So insubordination is the root of their government. Iniquity is the root of sin. Insubordination, iniquity, so, if you have a child that you recognize so naturally insubordinate, what do you do with your life? You rebel. So, and if you have a child that does that, and you have 12 children, how many of them are going to be caught? So the whisper is that the center. Because it's almost spiritual control. More people.
more mess around with Ouija boards because it's a spiritual contaminant. Yeah. Yeah.
Even if it were that vegetarian, it's still
Sometimes Ahab will be removed. Yeah. But usually there's an Ahab, there's somebody else. Ahab, again, Ahab can be removed. Because Jezebel is not going to be content until she brings destruction. That's what Jezebel is. And if Ahab gets it, then Ahab does it. I shouldn't leave another one. Well, I think I'm going to stay with you.
Feeling bad?
Yeah, she's not feeling so good. Real tired.
So lesson 4 is next week, right?
No, evidence is yours. You have this situation permanently.
Right here, that's 15.
So tonight, you go to William. Cops, you know, we got to assist you. Okay, so we have a chance here, an opportunity, I should say, to do a study guide. Going to Israel in 3 weeks. So Ken Garrison is going to take the class over. He will have 2 classes with you. So we're done with class 3 tonight. We're going to do a study guide.
And then we'll have class 5 the following week. The last class we will do before I leave is the class of Ruth, story of Ruth. And then Pastor Ken Garrison will take over from there. And you have a review, which will be the last class, a review, and whatever study guides that needs to be done at that. So, who knows exactly where we are with our study guides? Anybody? You don't think we've done any? I think you're right. All right, so study guide 1 we'll begin with. So am I back up and running there, Willie? Good. Study guide 1 we'll begin with. All right. So we're looking at the book of Joshua. Okay, the first section there is, the first question is, what were the boundaries of the territory given to Israel?
The wilderness of Lebanon
Right,
to the river Euphrates,
right.
and then the land of the Hittites,
Okay.
over to the Great Sea.
All right. Yep, that's about right. You have the region, if I can point it out here on the map, the land that was promised to Israel, the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, to the Euphrates, which is all the way up here, down to actually the Nile, and this is the region that's promised to Israel. Joshua, that was also what was promised to Abraham and Moses as well. All right. God exhorted Joshua to be strong and courageous. Joshua needed that encouragement because he was about to do something that was humanly impossible, and he needed to be convinced that God was a part of it, that God was actually leading the campaign. And later on, he came in contact with the captain of the Lord's host. And another way of saying that is the general of God's armies. And so once he realized that the general of God's armies was involved, then that gave him a little bit of encouragement, won't you see? And so, what was Joshua to do in order to succeed?
Observe all of Moses' law.
Remain with Torah, remain with the commandments, and meditate on it. It says, the angel said to him to meditate on the instructions, the law. Who helped the Israeli armies? Who held the Israeli spies in Jericho? And who was Rahab? She was a Canaanite prostitute. She worked at the city gate. She had an attachment apartment at the gate of Jericho, and she was a prostitute. And she actually was instrumental in the victory over the Canaanites at Jericho. Okay, what promise was given to this Canaanite woman?
Safety for all her family.
The entire family would be saved. What went before the people as they approached Jordan? All right, so they carry the Ark of the Covenant over the Jordan River. God dried up the Jordan, so Israel crossed over on dry land. Why did he do this? Practically speaking, he wanted to get them from east to west. Also, he wanted the nations to see his glory. Just as it was when he parted the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, he basically wanted the nations to see what he would do for his people Israel. Well, he did the same thing for the people of Israel as they began to enter into the land of Israel. All right, what three tribes supplied troops who went ahead of the rest of Israel into the land?
Reuben and Gad and Manasseh,
So Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh.
because they wanted the land before they never got on the side that they brought.
Right. They had
Promised that they would go ahead.
right. They had selected for themselves territory on the east side of the Jordan, from the Dead Sea all the way up to the Galilee. And as a result of that, they had to send troops over to fight on behalf of Israel. This was the agreement that Moses made with them. Note that God really wasn't directly involved in that agreement, which is interesting to really consider. All right, the base camp was at Gilgal, meaning rolling. What was the significance of this name? That their reproach was rolled away. That's what we believe. All right. It could have a very practical meaning as well, because at Gilgal is where they rolled rocks. They rolled the rocks into the River Jordan. They rolled the rocks all around Gilgal, where they made these footprints. And so Gilgal means rolling. For what covenant was circumcision an important provision? What does circumcision, what covenant does circumcision relate to? Abrahamic covenant, absolutely. Israel, coming away from their experience in the wilderness, had to begin circumcision all over again. They did not circumcise in the wilderness. Any ideas why they wouldn't circumcise in the wilderness? They were on the move, yes. And if you were circumcised in the wilderness, it would probably mean that you would have to consider the people, the babies, that were circumcised, and you wouldn't be able to be as mobile as you would be under normal circumstances. Perhaps also the wilderness was just not a practical place to conduct circumcisions, perhaps. That doesn't negate God's supernatural being, but again, perhaps it had something to do with that. We don't know. Okay, for what covenant was Passover an important provision? For Israel. So the circumcision had to do with the covenant with Abraham. Pesach had to do with God's covenant, or his relationship in the covenant with Israel. You see how you see the difference, right? Pesach became an ordinance, a festival at Goshen, as God was preparing to bring the descendants of Abraham out from bondage. That's when Pesach became a factor. After the renewal of their covenants, and after Israel ate of the produce of the land, God gave them no more manna. Their dispensation of manna came to an end. God was no longer providing manna for them because they came into the land of promise, the land flowing with milk and honey, and God wanted to make the point that you're in the land, so I'm no longer caring for you with manna. You will provide for yourself, right? So you look at it. You can look at it from a Christian perspective. There are times when God will supernaturally provide for you, but generally He wants you to provide for yourself when you've matured significantly. So perhaps in some cases God will supernaturally provide for you. That provision can be anything. Insight, revelation, money, provisions, literally. But comes a time when he wants you to work for it, and that relates to insight and revelation as well. Wants you to dig into his word. Wants you to work for what he gives you, right? Same with Israel. Again, like we said before, manna, if you see the Ten Commandments, right? Manna is this fluffy little cotton candy thing that comes down from the sky. According to Cesar de Mills, or is it Cesar Mills is his name? Yeah, the guy that did the movie. But what the Bible tells us is quite different. Manna is a seed. It's a green type thing that would be picked up on the floor, on the ground every morning like dew, would settle on the ground like dew. Doesn't mean it was fluffy and soft and sweet. It means that it was grain that will settle on the ground, and they would take the grain and they would crush it and make it into a paste, which is quite a process. And then they will take that paste and they will add water and they will make manna cakes. So manna wasn't this thing that just from hand to mouth, You had to work for it. Even what God would provide for you, you had to work for it. So that will preach, right? You can preach on that one. All right. So, who did Joshua meet on the plains of Jericho?
The commander of the Lord's army.
The general of God's army, right. The captain of the Lord's host. And who do we believe this individual was?
Jesus.
Right? That's a typical position that we believe that this was Jesus. Why do we believe this is Jesus?
I don't know.
Anyone? Because one of the very first thing that the angel said to Joshua is, take off your shoes, because the ground that you stand on is holy. This is what the angel said to Moses as he spoke to him from the burning bush. So we know that it was God, the Lord, who spoke to Moses from the bush, and his first interaction with Moses is, take off your shoes, this is holy ground. And this is what the angel said to Joshua at Jericho. So we get the sense there that you're dealing with more than just a messenger. You're dealing with the captain of the Lord's host. You're dealing perhaps with the pre-incarnated Jesus. Again, it doesn't tell us that. We don't know that for sure. But that's sort of a position that we take. The captain of the Lord's host. This person, the captain of the Lord's host, will appear other times in the Bible. And when he does, he's usually not just a regular angel. Nonetheless, this angel spoke with Joshua. If you look at some of the movies depicting that scene, it certainly is not depicted as the pre-incarnated Jesus, right? No, not at all. Usually he is a man, large, awesome-looking being, shining and so on, that would appear to Joshua. But we don't know that for sure, but there are people who would take that position that this was none other than Jesus himself. We don't know that for sure, but that's what we believe. It doesn't make our doctrine one way or the other. It doesn't fix our theology. It doesn't destroy our theology at the same time. Describe God's Bible. Right, the priests. The priests were to go before the armies of Israel. The armies of Israel would stay in the foreground, the background, and the priest would be in the foreground. The priest will circle the city 7 times, blowing the trumpet every time they circle the city. And then the last time, they would blow the trumpet loudly. And all the children of Israel will cry out, and the battle is on. Well, Israel didn't know that the walls were actually going to come crashing down. And so when they made the final pass around the city, the Kohanim, the priests, blew the shofar loudly, and the walls came crashing down. And the people of Israel, the sons of Israel, entered in and took spoils. Many, many years ago, I guess it must have been more than a century ago or so, they dug up the ruins of Jericho. And they've been working at the ruins of Jericho for ever since then. I'm not sure what they're doing now, but some years ago they determined that, well, the walls were The walls were here, and they were formidable walls for that period. But what they determined was that there was a fire, but the walls came down all at one time. Unlike the invasion of an army where certain parts of the walls will be taken down at certain period. For instance, if an army is going to a city, with a walled city, they will focus on one area. You know, they'll batter that one spot, that one area, and then once the wall is breached and they break in, then they will go through and destroy. Well, it was determined that the walls of Jericho all came down at one moment, at the same time, which again tells the story that the Bible narrative about Jericho was real. They did find fire, or what was obviously some sort of a fire that was associated with the city as well, again supporting the biblical narrative of the story of Jericho. All right? You can go there today if the Arabs would let you get close enough to it. They kind of control the area over there, which is a shame. But imagine yourself as an average Israeli participating in such a plan. What would that be like? You're an Israeli you're still in the Stone Age. Your essential weapon is a sling, a stone. You might have a sword or a spear that's been picked up along the way or given as spoil from the Egyptian army. 40-year-old sword, a 40-year-old spear. You didn't have chariots. You didn't have bow and arrows. You didn't have that technology. You were in the Stone Age. And you're pitted against a people that are war-hardened with chariots and standing armies and armory, and they're in the Iron Age and you're in the Stone Age. So what would it require for you to engage in such a battle? A lot of faith, to overcome a lot of fear, and to engage with a boldness and a courage that can only come through faith. And this is what Israel had. Now, you've seen the walls come crashing down after the shofar were blown. That's certainly an impetus for faith. You're certainly going to believe once you see that. But Israel had a weakness when it came to believing God. Right? That was an ongoing issue with Israel. The younger generation now that came up in the wilderness after 40 years, they were more prone to faith. They were more believing than the former generation. The former generation, they were ex-slaves, freed slaves, who were recently freed but had a tendency to want to go back into slavery. They had a tendency to not trust God, to forget real quickly what God had done. This is the problem, right? Not reckoning the most current history of what God had done. And this is why Israel found themselves complaining over and over and over. Book of Numbers, it's an amazing thing. They complain against God, they grumble against God continuously. Spirit of witchcraft, rebellion, insubordination. And this was the story of Israel. Now, the new generation, they were not as easily thrown into rebellion and witchcraft in that sense than the other generation, but they had weaknesses nonetheless. And they still had a problem with believing God. But they were much better than the former generation, right? Former generation had to be succeeded upon. God had to ensure that they all died out in the wilderness, which they did. Even Moses and Aaron was included, because even Moses and Aaron didn't obey God fully. All right, what was to be done with the precious metals found in the city?
Supposed to be given to the Lord, put in his treasure.
Right. Or some of it destroyed. If something had anything to do with idols, paganism, it destroyed, and so on. The caches that they would get from the city were to go towards the tabernacle, ultimately what will become the temple. So the story with Achan comes to mind at this point, right? All right. Why were they defeated at Ai? Why did Israel suffer defeat at Ai? And the sin came from the tribe of Judah, the family of Achan. What did Achan do? So let's read. How did Joshua determine who had sinned?
Well, first he sought the Lord, and then the Lord told him what to do.
Yeah. Well, firstly, he didn't sought the Lord with the situation at Ai. That was the problem. He didn't seek God's face at Ai. He just rushed up on the mountain and said, we can take these people here, this Canaanite people. And then he realized that he couldn't. He didn't really seek God's face carefully. If he had, God would have said to him, don't go because there's sin in the camp. So after the defeat at Ai, he goes before God, and then God says to him, there's sin in the camp. The lesson there is that you come to me first. You don't come to me after the fact. Come to me beforehand and seek my face, and I will give you directions. And anyway, he didn't do that, and so comes the time when he has to discover who it was that brought sin into the camp. And Achan's family, the tribe of Judah, was set apart first. How did they do it? By casting of lots, by the throwing of dice, effectively. You've heard of throwing bones, right? Craps throwing bones. Well, that's lots. That's what lots are. That's where the dice came from, bones, lots. So they cast their dice, and then the tribe of Judah was selected, and of the tribe of Judah, the family of Achan. And how did God respond to this rebellion? They had to be removed from the camp. Not pleasant, but that's what had to happen. They had to be made an example of. How did Joshua determine who had sinned? By casting of lots. What was done to Achan and his family? They were stoned and burned into nothingness. What did Joshua do with the king of Ai? He hung him and made. When you went in the ancient world, even in the more not so ancient world, you would hang someone to make a statement, right? You hang someone, it's a deterrent. You hang them high so that everyone can see them, and people will understand that this is not something you ever want to do. You never want to come against the authorities, otherwise you'll be hung high for everyone to see. And this is what Joshua did with the king of Ai, hung him. What did Joshua build at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim? He built an altar right between Ebal and Gerizim. We'll be there in a few weeks. Hopefully, I'm hoping that we can arrange to go up to Mount Gerizim and this time go to the lookout and look down upon Shechem. All right, so, and what did he do? Okay, let's see. Did you know, and did you know that Israeli archaeologists recently uncovered what is probably the remnant of these? So yes, they found evidence that there was an Israeli altar that was built in prehistoric times, not prehistoric, biblically historic times. So, and the evidence is there. There's a lot of evidence of the ancient people of Israel throughout the land of Israel. Throughout the land of Israel, a lot of evidence. At Shechem, you have these altars. Shechem is right there at Gerizim. In fact, if you go up on Mount Gerizim and you look down, Shechem is right there. Very small. The remains of ancient Shechem is very small, and it's right there. Okay. Why did Joshua make a mistake in dealing with the Gibeonites?
Because he didn't seek the Lord.
All right. He didn't inquire of God. Again, you always, before you act, you seek God's face, especially if you're in a situation that's imminent or emergent, important, war, engagement of any kind. You don't act without first going before God. Now, you don't go before God in the sense of this is my duty, and I'm just going to say, God, I'm about to do this. No, that's not what you do. You seek God's face. You go before Him. You say, God, I'm going to sit here quietly, and I'm going to let you lead me. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to act out without you telling me exactly how to proceed. All right? Now, again, sometimes you say, okay, well, Joshua had to seek God's face, and when he did, things went well. David had to do the same. So I'm going to seek God's face. So you go aside and you say, God, here's what I have. All right, and I'm going to do this. Bless me as I do this. Well, you didn't really seek his face. You more or less told him what you're going to do. No, that's not what you do. Joshua waited before God, and finally God gave him directions in regards to how to deal with Achan. But he didn't do this with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites caused a tremendous problem in Israel, right? Tremendous problem. But God is a God of second chances, right? Someone said that. God took that failure on behalf of Israel, on behalf of Joshua, and he turned it around. What did he do last week? We looked at this. He used the Gibeonites to draw out the Amorites, the Canaanites, to draw them out. And once they were drawn out, then he destroyed them. And that's the wonder of God, that he can take our horrible mistakes and he can fix them in such a way as to glorify himself and accomplish his purpose to begin with. Right? That's the way God works. So you make a mistake, you do something that's obviously wasn't in God's will, then you pause, you repent, you turn to him, and he can take your mistake and mold something really wonderful out of it. All right, what type of agreement did Israel enter into? It was a covenant of life. It was a covenant of life and death. It was a serious covenant, right? If the Gibeonites came and said, make a covenant with us. We'll join you in battle. We will be at your side. We will serve your people. You just have to protect us when we're attacked. Life and death. It's an important covenant. Well, such a covenant should not have been struck, should not have been cut, I should say, without God's approval, right? How did this violate God's purpose? Well, the Gibeonites were already condemned. God had condemned the Gibeonites to destruction. Well, last week we talked about God speaking to Abraham on the day of the covenant that he cut with Abraham, that his descendants will come out from slavery, who are the children of Israel, and will be an instrument of judgment against the Ammonites and all of the Canaanites, because the sin of the Canaanites were not yet complete. That's 400 years before Israel came in. So 400 years later, the sin of the Canaanites were complete. In other words, from God's point of view, the sin of the Canaanites were ready for judgment. And so they were set for judgment, and instead of bringing judgment, they made a covenant of peace with them outside of God's purpose. Yeah. And that's why Israel failed initially. But like I said, God redeemed the entire situation by using the very covenant that they illicitly formed with the Gibeonites to bring destruction upon the other ites, the Canaanites, right? And he does it, and he prevails, and the children of Israel prevail. All right, moving on. Who are the 5 kings making up the Southern Confederation?
I can't pronounce the name.
I can understand why. Let's just call out the cities that they were kings of. I know that the king of Jerusalem, his name was Adon-Zedek. Adon meaning Lord or Master. Zedek, Tzad-deek, right? Tzad-deek, righteous. He was the righteous master. That's what his name was. He was the king of Jerusalem. But then you had the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. So these were the 5 kings or the 5 cities that rose up, that God drew out, right? God kind of baited them. It's as if Joshua made a big mistake. He made this covenant with the Gibeonites. God looked at it and he shook his head and he said, Joshua, 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 what am I going to do with you? All right, I tell you what I'll do. I'll use this little mistake of yours to give you victory, and I'll show you how great I am in the process. And that's what he does. He takes the Gibeonites and he puts them out front like bait. And then all of these kings and kingdoms, they arise and they come against the Gibeonites. And well, that was it. God moved through Joshua to destroy them. We said last week that Joshua was so zealous for victory that he asked God to hold the sun in place for 24 hours. And what did God do? He held the sun in place for 24 hours. Right? An amazing story. These were all of nationality. They were Canaanites or Amorites. Right? The Amorite people were the leading tribe of the Canaanites. But they were all Canaanites. How did the Lord intervene in Israel's struggle against the confederation? Yes, and he also hailed upon them boulders, stones, and fire. And so God wanted to be sure that Israel would trust him. In the future, he brought boulders from the sky. You know, you go to Israel, and what do you see? You see a lot of boulders scattered everywhere throughout the land. I don't know if those were the boulders, but this is what God did. He brought a hail of boulders from the sky, and he destroyed the army. And as Israel began to chase the Amorites, God held the sun in place for 24 hours because Joshua asked him to do it. Isn't that amazing? It says that never before was there a situation or an occasion when God listened to a man. God listened to Joshua. What can we take away from that? What can we glean from that story? That God listened to Joshua and held the sun in place for an entire 24-hour period. I did my best to try and give you an illustration of how they believe, they being scientists, how they believe the universe works, right? Hubble, this incredible telescope that you paid for, that's sitting out there somewhere, that's taking pictures of the universe. There's some outstanding pictures of galaxies, which are confirming what scientists have been saying about galaxies, that they're just plates, plates, and huge swirls, plates that swirl around in the universe. And they're discovering that these things are very mobile. These galaxies, our galaxy, the Milky Way, is extremely mobile and moves at incredible speeds. Now, you can't be a flat earther and understand what I'm saying. If you're a flat earther, forget it. I'm as apostate as I can possibly be. But anyway, if this is true, the entire universe seems to be swirling at tremendous pace. The galaxy, our galaxy, the solar systems, all of the solar systems are just moving. And God stopped all of it. If this is true, he stopped all of it for 24 hours. He had to. He had to. Otherwise, you'd have solar systems crashing into solar systems, perhaps galaxies crashing into galaxies, if he only stopped planet Earth. Because if everything is moving, zipping through space, and he holds our planet still, what happens? Before long, we're out in the middle of space somewhere. He stopped his creation. He stopped the wonder of his creation. And I don't think we will ever truly understand how wonderful this creation is until he gives us the mind to understand the creation and the wonder of the universe or the universes. We don't know. We know about it. But anyway, God did something incredibly powerful because Joshua asked for it. What's the key? What's the key that brought this incredible situation to bear? Faith. You're absolutely right. Faith. But more than faith, I would say to you that Joshua was inquiring within God's purpose. God had a purpose, and it was a grand purpose. He had purposed the destruction of the Amorite for centuries. And now he's bringing it to bear, and Joshua is believing that he will be instrumental in this purpose. And he's asking for something that's downright impossible, but I'm going to do it for him because he's showing me faith. And faith in the context of my will. That's a message there for us. When we believe in perfect faith, in context of God's will, he will hold the planet still for us. Do you understand me? So if you're in a struggle and you know that the struggle is against God's will for your life, you have every reason to stand in faith and watch him hold the planet still for you. Do you understand me? The problem is the faith to believe for it. That's where we fall short. Do we have the and that's what Joshua had. Joshua had the tenacity and the boldness to say, wait a minute, I'm doing God's perfect will here. And God's perfect will is that this army would be destroyed. God, you just hold the sun for me. God said, hold my bear. And he holds the sun still. Joshua destroys the Amorites. God responded well, right? It was as if God rejoiced in Joshua's faith. It was powerful. All right. A wonderful story. That will preach, for sure. Why did Joshua cause the chiefs of the men of war to place their feet? Let me read that again. Why did Joshua cause the chiefs of the men of war to place their feet on the necks of the Canaanite kings before they were slain?
To show they had no reason to be afraid, that they were to be strong and of good courage.
All right.
That he would put all their enemies under their feet.
Right.
And obey him.
So there's an obvious messianic connotation to it. Paul wrote at the end of the book of Romans that the God of peace will soon bruise Satan's head under your feet. Now, it also goes back to Genesis chapter 3, right? What was the promise I guess you can say it's a promise. What was the curse that God spoke concerning the serpent? But he will bruise your head. So it goes back to that we will actually defeat the enemy and his head will be under our feet, or his neck will be under our feet. I go to the chiropractor, and in that case, my neck is under his hands. And he says, wiggle your toes, and then he goes,
I know, and you hear it really good.
You know why he says wiggle your toes, right? So that you won't think about what he's about to do. And that's no fun.
That's true.
But I'm learning the game over the chiropractor. I'm learning how to. Anyway, so here is that reality that God will bruise the head of the evil one under our feet. The picture of that is clear in this case. All right. Who was the leader of the northern Canaanite confederation? Hazor was the city. Jabin, right? The story of Deborah and Barak and Jael. Jael ended up being the one who killed Jabin. Jael killed Jabin. And we talked about it a little bit just now. And what was the essence of the story? Well, Barak refused to believe. He was a little bit timid. All right, he didn't want to enter into battle without the strength of Deborah alongside him, and this didn't attract Deborah's attention at all. She wasn't flattered by the fact that Barak didn't want to go into battle without her. She saw it as weakness, and she said, "No, you're showing weakness." And at the end of the battle, when Jael did what she did and defeated Jabin, again, Deborah wrote the song and everybody sang, and the irony is that Barak had to sing along with it. So Barak stood there and sang about his cowardness. If you read the account of the song that was composed by Deborah, Barak sang with her, and he sang about the fact that he wasn't man enough to kill Jabin. Now that's a little bit weird, isn't it? I don't think I would want to stand there and sing that song. Anyway, that's the way it was. The ancient world, and the attitude in the ancient world was entirely different. What did Joshua do to Hazor?
He killed it with the sword.
All right, he destroyed it. He burnt it. Why did God harden the hearts of the Canaanites?
So that they would be completely destroyed.
Right.
That Israel would get no ground and show no mercy.
All right. So this Jabin, all right, the Jabin that was destroyed in the Northern Confederation, or the Northern Campaign, has to be a different Jabin than the Jabin that Jael killed because of the time lapse. Because Joshua killed Jabin, and so did Jael, right? So a different Jabin, perhaps a descendant of the first Jabin, right? Okay, so why did God harden the hearts of the Canaanites? So that he would utterly and completely destroy them. So God hardens the hearts of those who hate him in order to execute his judgment. And that's why, I'm going to say this, that's why God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay evil for evil. In other words, we can trust God that God will execute his purpose, right? He will harden the hearts of our enemies, and you'll see your enemies seemingly prevailing, but they're not really prevailing. God is bringing them to judgment. So God will harden the hearts of his enemies in order to execute his judgment. So today in Israel, people are still, today, Monday, right now it's Tuesday morning in Israel. It's not dawn yet, but it's Tuesday morning. And people are still mourning over the death of Uri, the young woman that was, I can say it here, she was raped by 4 men, stabbed to death, and they stabbed her so many times on her neck that eventually she was decapitated. That's what they did. And so Israel today is still mourning over the death of this child, 19 years old. She was very innocent, very childish, may have had some sort of a handicap of some sort. And this brutal act was horrible. And so you say, why God? Why are your enemies prevailing in this way? God has hardened the hearts of the Philistines, the Palestinians of today, the Muslims in general, but he has hardened particularly the hearts of the Palestinians of today, the Hamas, Hezbollah. He has. It's the only explanation, the only thing we can conclude. He's hardened their hearts because they are committed to the destruction of Israel. They're committed themselves. They're hardened murderers. And I got to tell you this, and this might be difficult to deal with as an American citizen. We paid for that. That's our baby. Because for decades we've supported the Palestinians financially. And the Palestinians are being paid to go out and do these things. The murderer who committed this heinous act, his family is going to receive $3,500 every month. I make a little over $3,500 a month. Just a little. I think I do enough for it. This guy is going to go to prison, and because he's committed this act, he's going to get, his family is going to be guaranteed $3,500 a month. He's going to go to prison where he's going to be well kept, well fed. He's going to get a degree. He's going to become a martyr. He's already a hero, and he's being worshipped, praised. You see, God has hardened the heart of the Philistines in order, when he brings judgment, he will be perfectly just. He's judging the hearts of men. He is. He is looking to see who is going to stand with the Palestinians and who will not. God does that, yes. The God of the Bible does that. Not just the God of the Old Testament, but the God of the New Testament as well. You see, because when you stand with the Palestinians, you're taking the mark of the cursed people, the Palestinians. You take their mark. You agree with them. You take a mark. It may not be the actual mark of the beast, but you take a spiritual mark on your forehead when you agree with them. When you stand against them, what mark do you take? You take the mark of God. So I would say concerning the Palestinians that it's a better place to be where you take the mark of God, you see what's happening there from God's point of view, and you stand with God. Much better place. It's a travesty to see people on the left, politically on the left, all running to say, whoa, 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 she was killed, yes, but what about all of the young boys that are brutally treated by the Palestinians, even killed from time to time? Not to mention that the young boys are all terrorists. Right? So what's happening? CNN, MSNBC, and most of these global news outlets have taken the mark of the Palestinians. They have taken the mark of God's enemies. So God is weighing the hearts of the people to see if they're going to stand with his enemies or not. In the meantime, he's hardening the hearts of his enemies, and he is sifting the hearts of everyone else. That's what God is doing. And it's very sad to see that most of the left in this country have given their hearts over to the devil himself. All right, so that's the end, right on time. Have a good week. I'm going to bring the corrected tests next week. Again, I'm going to teach 2 more classes before we go to Israel.